Welcome to today's edition of Rediscover China in the UK. Today's topic is Chinese wallpaper in the UK. This is a part of the All Under One Moon series from September to December 2021. And in his remarks at the National Day celebration, Professor Martin Arbroath of the British Academy said that the program of All Under One Moon was launched as a multimedia series of events, making full use of up-to-minute digital resources and ranging from presenting cooking classes to exploring nature reserves, from commemorating the 1911 revolution to poverty alleviation in China. And it includes over 40 projects. And we, he said, in Britain can be proud that so many projects involve this country's collaboration. And the 3 months long series are presented by China National Tourist Office, London, Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, among others, and supported by many project and press partners, including Chinese Embassy in the UK. And please allow me here to express our sincere thanks from the Embassy to all those who have joined hands in delivering these series to both British and Chinese audience. Today's Rediscover China in the UK is part of this All Under One Moon. And now a few words of some background information. First, there is an old Chinese saying which goes as 勤耕雨读, work in the field when it is sunny, and read at home in your study when it is raining. And when COVID-19 interrupts our traveling around, and we have ways of fighting it, of course, while enjoying our travel. So to read and study at home before we travel. And second, and this is just instrumental to the birth of the idea behind the initiation of Rediscover China in the UK series. It is a series of talks by experts about UK-based, China-related, and visitor-accessible destinations. For example, Dr. Frances Wood took the lead earlier this year in her talk, The Making of Modern China, from Dr. Sun Yat-sen to the May 4th movement. And thirdly, Emile's detailed study of Chinese wallpaper in this country, which we are going to hear today, was brought to us by Dr. Frances Wood, for which we thank her very much in the first place. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Frances Wood to continue the story before moderating the talk by Emile De Bruijn. Frances, are you there? Over to you then. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to continue to participate in the series of Rediscover China in the UK. As Yupeng said, we can't travel to China at the moment. Chinese people can't travel to the UK at the moment, but we do have ways of continuing to learn about the relationship between our two countries. And in this case, particularly the relationship of aesthetics and handicraft and the beauty of some aspects of Chinese production. When the Queen visited China in 1986, which was a historic moment, the British Embassy in Peking did a lot of preparation. And one of the things they did was to put up newly made Chinese wallpaper in the dining room of the British Embassy. This was had a yellow base, but it contained wonderful paintings of birds, flowers, and garden scenes, and was based upon photographs from a country house in the UK, which had been sent to China to the Red Lantern factory, where the wallpaper was carefully copied. And I think that's quite a nice thing. That wasn't exactly rediscover China in the UK. That was, as it were, rediscover the UK in China. But the intention was to show that there had been this very, very important aspect of interior decoration in the UK for many centuries, which had involved the production of Chinese wallpapers in China, which was sent to England and put up in so many country houses throughout the nation. And one of the good things is that many of these wallpapers have survived, and it's possible to visit an enormous number of country houses in the UK, many of which are under the guidance of the National Trust now, and still see Chinese wallpaper, hand produced in China, hand painted, beautifully decorated, and put up in a wonderful fashion for all things Chinese, which existed in the UK in the 18th and early 19th century. And some of you may have seen Emile's wonderful book, which inspired me to show it to Yupeng, because I felt, again, whilst he was in England, unable to go back to China, but could still visit many of these houses. And so it's a great pleasure for me today to introduce Emile and hear more about the discoveries that he made when he wrote his wonderful book. So Emile, may I hand over to you, and I look forward very much to your talk.
Thank you very much indeed, Francis. That's a fascinating story about the Chinese wallpaper in the British Embassy. I'll try and share my screen now so you can, here we are. Can you all see that? That's great. So yes, indeed, I'm going to talk about Chinese pictorial wallpapers in the United Kingdom. As Francis said, they've been here for hundreds of years, and it's a story of two groups of people, Chinese producers and British consumers, two groups of people who didn't really understand each other very well often, but who communicated through these objects, through these wallpapers. The producers responded to European and British demand for these wallpapers, and of course the consumers in Britain responded with alacrity, with enthusiasm to these beautiful wallpapers. So let's see, I'll try and move it forward. Here we are. And the story of this amazing product, Chinese wallpapers, is of course intimately connected with the story of Chinese luxury goods coming to Europe from the 16th century onwards. And this porcelain plate is a good example of that, the kind of porcelain that was produced in Ming Dynasty China, initially for the Portuguese and the Spanish, this particular type of decoration. Of course, it includes traditional Chinese motifs. You can see the bird and flower imagery there in the center. But this particular type was specifically made for the Portuguese and the Spanish. And then towards the end of the 16th century, Northwest European countries like England and the Dutch Republic also started to trade with China through the maritime trade routes. And the English East India Company, which was a joint stock trading company set up specifically for trade with East Asia, was founded in 1600. And they also began to bring back plates like these to England. And of course, this was an amazing product at the time, this material porcelain, which was much much harder than European ceramics at the time, and much more brilliantly and accurately decorated. So it was an extraordinary product that caused amazement in Northwest Europe, and these were highly coveted objects. Interestingly, this kind of porcelain in England was known as craqueware, which is a kind of a version of the Portuguese word caraca, which was the type of Portuguese ship through which these wares were originally brought to Europe in the 16th century. And here we have the next slide. At about the same time, the late 16th century or the early 17th century, we also see the first signs of Chinese woven and embroidered silks coming to England, or the first surviving examples, at least. They probably had been coming before then as well. This lady here, Elizabeth, Countess of Shrewsbury, was a powerful, wealthy aristocrat in England in the late 16th century, Elizabethan England. And she had a great taste for textiles, and still today in her country house, Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, is still filled with many of her sumptuous textiles, most of them European. But also, interestingly, they include two cushion covers, which are shown here on the left, which are made from blue silk woven damask with a pattern of lotus. And this is one of the earliest surviving examples of Chinese woven silk in an English country house. Another grand lady of the 17th century was Amalia von Solms-Braunfels, the Princess of Orange. She was married one of the members of the House of Orange, the rulers of the Dutch Republic. And this lady too had a very strong and interesting taste for East Asian luxury objects. She collected Chinese and Japanese porcelain and silks, and also Japanese lacquer, and used those extensively in her homes, in her palatial interiors in the Netherlands. And among the things she would have owned would have been things like this kind of De Bruijn porcelain, sometimes known as Blanc de Chine in Europe, because from inventories of her residences, it's clear that this kind of porcelain would have been there, both figurines and other objects. These objects you can see here are from Belton House in Lincolnshire, which was one of the National Trust's country houses, one of the country houses in the care of the National Trust, and but they date from the same period, from the second half of the 17th century. It's really interesting, the objects on the left, originally that would have been an incense burner, but in Europe at the time, these kind of objects were often used on the dining table to hold various kinds of foods as a sort of delicate, elegant container for sugar or for other spices or things like that. And here you see one of the interesting aspects of this global trade, that on the one hand, Europeans were very keen on Chinese objects like this. On the other hand, they didn't always really understand them very well, and they invented new purposes for them and new ways of using them. These are other types of objects that Amalia von Solms also would have known, like Wutsai porcelain and also Japanese Numban lacquer, which you can see on the right here. And again, both of these categories of objects figure in the inventories of her residences. And porcelain would be used in European interiors at this time in fairly large quantities, and they would be placed together on top of cabinets or shelves to create impressive glittering displays. And of course, this would have been even more dramatic in the candlelight and the firelight of the period, and deliberately used in that way. And equally, lacquer would have had the same sort of reflective function and been very dramatic and beautiful in firelight and candlelight. And Amalia van Solms is also known to have taken East Asian lacquer objects like this Japanese Namban chest, taken it apart quite brutally in a way, but taken it apart to use it to panel small rooms, to use it as wall paneling. And again, this shows a kind of European disregard for East Asian culture. They didn't sort of respect the integrity of the objects, but on the other hand, they valued them so much that they wanted to be literally surrounded by these amazing materials, which they themselves couldn't produce. And of course, this type of lacquer was included gold and silver and mother of pearl as well, which made it very dramatic. In the late 17th century, Europeans were starting to travel to China regularly, of course, still in small numbers, but and those who had been to China occasionally produced books about their experiences. And one of these books by Johann Nieuwhof, which documented a diplomatic mission of the Dutch East India Company to the Chinese court in the 1650s. This book became very popular and very influential because it had many beautiful illustrations, and these illustrations really fired the imagination of Europeans and made this book very, very popular. And they're not always completely accurate. Again, you can see the process of distortion happening, that the European engravers who are making these illustrations didn't completely understand, of course, excuse me, all the original significance and shape of the Chinese art and architecture. But images like this of the porcelain pagoda at Nanjing were made a great impression, and this is probably also the book and the image that created the association between pagodas and China in the European imagination. The pagoda became a kind of symbol of China from that time onwards. And also the figure of Kung Fu Tzu, Confucius, as he became known in Europe, also became a symbol of China from that time onwards. And in particular, the Jesuit religious order who had been working in China wrote extensively about Kung Fu Tzu, and in a very positive vein. And oh, something has happened. I might have to share my screen again. For some reason, it's just popped. Let me just do it again. Here we are. Can you all see that? Good. Okay, I'll carry on. So, and of course, the European name Confucius, the Latinized version of Kung Fu Tzu's name, was also in effect coined by the Jesuits. So they had a big role in on the one hand, providing information about Chinese philosophy and religion, and on the other hand, popularizing that in Europe, and again making Confucius into a kind of emblem of China, the idea of the benign sage and the importance of philosophy in Chinese society, and the importance of virtue in Chinese polity and things like that. This all worked together to create a positive image about Chinese society in 17th century Europe. Europe at that time was riven by political and religious strife and wars. So the idea of political and historical continuity in China was very attractive, and also the idea of government civil servants who were appointed on the basis of merit rather than because of their aristocratic pedigree. That was also an attractive feature to Europeans at that time. So all these factors together created this image of China in Europe. But on the material side as well, of course, Chinese objects were coming to Europe, and this is a wonderful painting because it provides a glimpse of the kind of objects people in Northern Europe would have had in about 1680. This is a painting of a Dutch family having tea, and you can actually see it's interestingly, it's the husband who's pouring the tea. This idea of tea parties being associated with ladies came much later. In the 17th century, a man could proudly hold the teapot and pour the tea. And you can actually see it's a Yixing teapot he's holding, which is really interesting. And but the table is fascinating as well, and we still haven't quite worked out where this type of lacquer table originated. It could have come from Java or potentially from Vietnam as well. We're not entirely sure yet, but you can see it's been raised on a European base. Originally, it was a low table for people to sit on the floor around, but in this context, in the European context with chairs, it had to be raised, so they created an extra layer below. And again, this shows the adaptation of Asian objects for European habits and social customs. And here is one of those actual tables at Ham House in Richmond upon Thames. And the teapot here is a white Guangzhou ware teapot with European silver gilt mounts. Again, this shows the value that was placed on these kinds of teapots, that they were given precious mounts. And this was the sitting room of the Duchess of Lauderdale, who the Duke and Duchess of Lauderdale owned Ham House and refurbished it in the 1670s in a very lavish style, including these kinds of objects. The chair behind it is fascinating too. It's an English chair, but it's trying to imitate Chinese Kwansai lacquer. So again, you can see the European artisans on the one hand modifying Asian objects, and on the other hand imitating them as well. This is another object at Ham House, and a cabinet, and it's also an example of modification, because the material of the cabinet is again Chinese Kwansai lacquer, so incised lacquer, where the lacquer, the imagery is carved into the lacquer and then filled in with polychrome pigments. Originally, however, this lacquer was in the form of one long panel, and it must have been exported to Europe as a long panel. And that panel was then cut into several sections, and those sections were used to decorate this cabinet, the different sides of this cabinet. So it's very much a modified Asian object. And if you look carefully on the right, you can see a little cut in the scenery where it's been cleverly kind of fitted together. And this was very much the practice at the time, to modify East Asian objects. They were hugely valued, they were very expensive, but at the same time, they were often heavily modified. And this is an example of, again, Kwansai lacquer, incised lacquer. This is one of the rooms that Amalia von Solms would have known, the use of East Asian lacquer to completely panel a room. This is one of the few surviving rooms of that type. This one is from 1695, It used to be in Leeuwarden in the northern Netherlands. And it shows again that sort of the overwhelming effect that these rooms had, and the reflective qualities which were deliberately used in these Baroque interiors, and also the way in which it was combined with porcelain, with large numbers of porcelain items. And this is a room at Belton House where you see another version of this, and here the effect of the lacquer has been copied in English tapestry. And originally the backgrounds of these tapestries would have been a bit darker, so it would have looked a bit like Kwansai lacquer, and it has the same overall composition of Kwansai lacquer, but it was completely designed and executed by John van der Mack the Elder, who supplied tapestries to the English court and also to the owners of Belton House, where these two survive. This kind of thing was also done in painted paneling. So here you see the artist Robert Robinson creating a sort of Asian style landscape painted paneling. Again, this would have been a whole room like this. The panels survive in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And you can also see how much fantasy was involved in that. This was really a European fantasy of China, and in some ways it was really diverging quite far away from the real China. But if, for instance, in the middle panel in the distance, you can see a pagoda towering there in the distance. So yeah, this was the European image of China at the time. And also in silver, Chinese people were depicted in this kind of way, in sort of vaguely East Asian costumes, and in a very Baroque sort of English idiom. So it was complete fantasy, but it was a very sort of, the British public was very eager for anything that could be called Chinese. And interestingly, this kind of object was used for, it would have contained alcohol for punch, and it would have been used for drinking parties, for male drinking parties. So again, at this point, the taste for China was very much also a male taste as well as a female taste. And here is another example of the use of porcelain in Baroque interiors, and a lot of this spread via the members of the House of Orange. Interestingly, Amalia von Solms was a Princess of Orange. This was her granddaughter who became Queen of England, Queen Mary II, and she helped to bring that taste for East Asian objects to England. And one of Queen Mary II's acquaintances was Elizabeth Seymour, Duchess of Somerset, and this is Petworth House, you can see on the left, with displays of Chinese porcelain and Japanese lacquer. And this was how Queen Mary and her circle were using East Asian objects at that time. Interior. And the same kind of taste was expressed in painted leather. This is an English leather screen imitating, again, Kwansai lacquer. And you can see, to people who know Kwansai lacquer, of course, that you can see that it clearly isn't Kwansai lacquer, but this was the leather workers' imitation of it. And they were using gilding and various different colors, again, to achieve a similar effect at a slightly lower price point, obviously. You can see the ladies on the right here trying to show a game of Wei Qi being played there. But also actual Chinese embroidered silk was coming to England at that time. And often they survive on state beds, like this state bed at Cork Abbey, which has two amazingly well preserved types of embroidered Chinese silk, one with a blue ground and one with a white ground, and wonderfully preserved. But you can also see how radically the silk was modified to fit the contours and the shapes of a Baroque bed. So again, the mixture of admiration on the one hand, but on the other hand, relatively radical use of these materials. And here we're now starting to get closer to the actual subject of this talk, Chinese wallpaper, because by the early 18th century, in Europe, Chinese paintings started to be used as wall coverings. As we've seen, there was this huge and intense taste for Chinese luxury products. At the same time, the ways European walls were being decorated were evolving, and wallpaper was developing as a type of wall covering, replacing tapestries and paneling. And people turned to Chinese paintings, for instance, to decorate their walls. And this is one of the rare surviving examples from the early days of that in about 1720 in Munich in the Pagodenburg. And you can see there bird and flower hanging scrolls being used. Of course, in China itself, there was wallpaper being used in the 18th century, but this was very different wallpaper, much as you can see in this wonderful picture from a fascinating album in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, showing various mansion or palace interiors of the mid-18th century. You can see the various different types of wall coverings, including what seems to be wallpaper, but relatively plain, perhaps textured, but certainly not pictorial. The pictorial elements are distinct paintings hung on top of the wallpaper, or sometimes pasted on top of the wallpaper. And you can see various different examples in this interior of that. But the combination of pictorial and wallpaper doesn't seem to have been used very much in China itself. So that seems to have been a European paintings as wallpaper. And of course, in China, there's a long tradition of landscape painting and landscape imagery, and the symbolic and auspicious connotations of landscape imagery. For instance, this famous hand scroll, the Gusu von Huatu, or known as Prosperous Suzhou, a sort of panoramic view of the city of Suzhou, including scenes like this. And of course, these landscape scenes were often associated with the harmony and productivity of society, and showing the entirety of society there in one landscape image. Also, another important artistic tradition, of course, in Chinese art is bird and flower painting. And again, this type of painting had lots of symbolic and auspicious connotations, like this wonderful example in the Palace Museum from the second half of the 15th century. And examples of both of these types of art did start to come to Europe as well. And of course, the Europeans wouldn't understand the finer details of the symbolism of bird and flower or landscape imagery, but they did appreciate the artistry and the beauty of them. Of course, porcelain was coming to Europe in large numbers as well. And it's interesting that in Chinese porcelain, for instance, you see peonies, like on this example. Peonies had been popular in Chinese art since the Tang period. Leaf scrolls, like you see in this image as well, go back even further, and some of these leaf scrolls were introduced into Chinese art from Central Asia through Buddhism, so they have a very long history as well. But interestingly, in the Yuan dynasty, those kinds of images, both the leaves and the peonies and birds like this, were re-exported to the Islamic world through the export of blue and white porcelain. So it's a really interesting movement of styles from Central Asia to China, from China to the Islamic world going on here. And eventually these same leaf and flower motifs turn up in Indian chintz fabrics as well, like this example from the late 17th century. So that is another fascinating example of how that stylistic imagery moved around. And these chintzes were then exported to Europe, very popular in England in the second half of the 18th century. And interestingly, chintz influenced and was influenced by English crewel work, this embroidered wool embroidery on fustian part cotton, part linen fabrics like this. And experts are still not entirely clear who was influencing whom with regard to crewel work and chintz. They seem to have been mutually influencing each other. And again, you can see the distinctive leaves popping up here. So, but certainly both crewel work and chintz were very popular in late 17th century England. And that was reflected in English wallpapers as well. You can clearly see some chintz influences here as well, but also perhaps a Chinese female figure in the top left-hand corner holding a fan, and perhaps some kind of peacock lower down. So it's a complete mixture of various Asian motifs in an English wallpaper. And in the 18th century as well, the English continued to produce Asian-style wallpapers, and this one clearly seems to be influenced both by Chinese bird and flower painting and perhaps also by chintz, Indian chintz imagery. At the same time, in the first half of the 18th century, sometimes there were critical notes in England about East Asian luxury goods. Some people in England were rather worried about the money being spent on porcelain and lacquer and silk and so on. So, and this is a satirical painting by William Hogarth showing a dissolute spendthrift young couple running up debts, and on the chimney piece behind them is filled with expensive De Hua porcelain. So this is a kind of satirical take on that taste. But that taste was kind of unstoppable, and it continued. And this is an example of Chinese prints and paintings being used as wallpaper. One of the first examples in England, probably from the 1740s at Saltram. And you can see various different prints and paintings, landscapes and figures, all arranged carefully by the English paper hangers in a symmetrical scheme. And these were probably made in Suzhou, we think, and some of them were clearly prints and some of them were paintings on paper. And another room in the same house in Saltram shows this rather fascinating scene. And this is actually a collage of multiple copies of two different prints. And if you look at the next image, you can see how those two prints have been cleverly combined. We think prints show scenes from the Sangguozhe, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So these were probably prints which were originally made for the Chinese market, but somehow they were bought by East India Company merchants and brought to England and used as wallpaper. And obviously the people at Saltram would have had no idea of the meaning of the imagery, but they clearly appreciated the beauty of it. And English commentators like William Chambers, the architect, who produced a book about China called Designs of Chinese Buildings in 1757. He was clearly looking at these prints because you can see the plate from his book on the left is clearly inspired by some of those female figures in those prints you can see on the right. They're probably Taoist immortals. And Chambers seems to have taken various elements from those two prints on the sides you can see there and combined them in this figure he put in his book. So you could probably buy these prints in shops in London or at paper hangers establishments. And then in the 1750s, in about 1750, you start to see full-length pictorial wallpapers for the first time coming in from China, probably produced in response to the European demand for these pictorial wallpapers, but now being produced probably by artisans in Suzhou, because that was a center for woodblock printing, and these initial wallpapers were completely woodblock printed with hand-colored details. And this is the first documented example at Felbrick Hall, which was hung in 1752. See the two pheasants on the rock there. And here you can see that it actually is woodblock printing. You can see some small breaks in the black lines here and there, indicating that it's printing, but at the same time, highly realistic and sophisticated rendering of birds and flowers there. And occasionally, the same woodblock printed wallpaper survives in several different places in Europe. As you can see, Uppark on the left in West Sussex, Schloss Wörlitz in Germany in the center, and Uitermote in Kent on the right. They are all basically the same pair of pheasants on the rock, but they've all been hung in slightly different ways, combined by the paper hangers in slightly different ways, which is fascinating as well, and preserved in different degrees of color, etc. But this also shows how popular it was across Europe, not just in Britain. This lady, Elizabeth Montagu, was a wealthy intellectual, the mid-18th century, and she was one of the people who explicitly wrote about her dressing room, which was decorated in Chinese style, and she explicitly described it as feminine. She said, "Oh, my dressing room is the feminine equivalent of my husband's great room downstairs." And this is an interesting marker that at this time, the Chinese style was becoming associated with the feminine parts of the house, the lady's domain in the house. And her dressing room was also where Mrs. Montagu received her intellectual circle. So it was her salon, as it were. Here you can see a landscape wallpaper. Landscape was now also being used in this wallpaper format here at Blickling Hall. And by this time, 1760, it was fully hand-painted. So it may have come from Guangzhou by that time. Probably the trade shifted from Suzhou to Guangzhou because of the start of the Canton system in 1757. That's why we think they switched from printing to hand painting being done in Guangzhou. And this is one of the earlier examples of that. Here you can see the interesting stylistic contrast between the Jiehua style used for the architecture, the very linear, precise style used for the architecture, and the much more calligraphic style used for the rocks and the trees. This is again on the Blickling wallpaper. But in the overmantel picture, the picture over the mantelpiece, they inserted fragments from two different prints. So sometimes you can see the paper hangers improvising and using elements in a different way. It's actually two prints, bits of two prints, and you can see a sort of vague how it's been put together, 3/4 to the right. Again, in a relatively radical way, but this is how it was done. And the same prints survive. Again, probably wallpaper panels or used on a folding screen. Survive in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So at this time you see the transition from printing to hand painting. And again, a fully hand painted wallpaper at Harwood House in Yorkshire, and installed by Thomas Chippendale, the cabinet maker, who also supplied the imitation Chinese furniture. And here you can see how that particular wallpaper shows scenes of silk production, tea production, and porcelain production. And actually, the scenes on the wallpaper are actually derived from the Yujigingjitu, or the treatise on telling and weaving, which had been the one of the compendia on manufactures and agriculture. And here you can, if you look in the image on the left, bottom right-hand corner, you can see exactly the same vignette shown in the print on the right of the interior of silk producer's house, with a baby being shown at another woman. So a direct quote from Yujigingjitu. At the same time, China was also being used, the Chinese style was also being used in English gardens. You start to see pavilions in English gardens in the Chinese style, again, in a very fantastical way, but nevertheless showing an interest in China in a garden setting. And here you see a pagoda at Shugborough Hall, which was built in about 1747, combined with garden pavilions in classical and Gothic styles. And it's interesting how the Chinese style played a similar role to the Gothic and the classical styles in being a kind of emblem or symbol of history, continuity, virtue, sophistication. And China was one of the Chinese style was one of the styles you could use to express those ideas or concepts. And here at Groom Court, there was the style of bridge that was known as Chinese. Of course, it's not really Chinese, but this is what was described as Chinese at the time. And again, so not just buildings, but also bridges and sometimes boats in the Chinese style. This one has recently been restored at Groom Court. And of course, the pagoda at Kew, the largest example of these pagodas being built in England in the mid-18th century as part of the burgeoning English landscape style. At the same time, other products like these figures with nodding heads, which were made in China for export to Europe in the second half of the 18th century, an elderly couple you can see here, and these turned up in the highest circles. This is Queen Charlotte of England, painted in the early 1760s with her two eldest sons. And if you look behind her, you can see a very similar pair of nodding head figures behind her in her boudoir. Also on the stage, there were Chinese themes on the English stage. This is the actress Mary Ann Yates as appearing in a play called The Orphan of China, which was set in the period of the beginning of the Qing dynasty, and it was all about conflict between duty and emotion and familial duty and national duty and so on. It's a very dramatic, tragic play, but using Chinese themes and pseudo-Chinese costumes. So this was very much permeating English culture at the time. In furniture too, I've mentioned Chippendale already, but here you can see some examples of his Chinese style furniture, which is a very interesting mixture of classical European elements and Chinese elements mixed together in quite a sophisticated way. You almost can't tell where the classical ends and the Chinese begins. Really fascinating. And he also supplied this bird and flower wallpaper at Nostell Priory in 1771, and the same together with the furniture, and the same, that wallpaper also then inspired English printed cotton that you can see on the right here. You can see the phoenix there in the English printed cotton is exactly the same phoenix as the one in the Nostell wallpaper on the left. The English producers probably didn't know it was a phoenix. They probably thought it was some kind of real bird, but it's striking how directly they copied it. This is exactly the same wallpaper as at Nostell Priory, but in a green version. And this shows how the Chinese painting workshops were innovating. They were providing variety and new products in order to keep the European market interested. This is at Erddig in Wales, hung in the 1770s. And again, this is exactly the same wallpaper, but in a blue version, hung at Cobham Hall in Kent. All completely hand painted, but probably using exactly the same models for all of these wallpapers. And this relates probably to the developing taste for color in interior decoration in Europe in the later 18th century. Susan North, the fashion scholar, has connected taste for increasing color in costume, in fashion, and linked that to European porcelain, like these Sèvres porcelains in bright blue and green. But I think this also relates to the taste for Chinese wallpapers, and how those wallpapers also start to show more and more color towards the end of the 18th century. We don't know exactly who was influencing whom. Probably they were all talking to each other. East India Company merchants were talking to the Chinese producers and keeping them up to date with European fashions, most likely. This is another innovation, the use of separate pictures, sets of separate pictures being supplied by the Chinese painting workshops. So this is a step further from the initial use of paintings and prints we saw earlier. Now they were being supplied as a set, so the paper hangers could hang them straight away and achieve a uniform effect, like you can see here. This is some of the details of that. Some of the imagery comes from the Yuji Genjitu, again, showing agriculture and manufactures. And here you can see on the left, scene of silk production, and more or less the same scene surviving in a wallpaper in Germany. And here the painting workshops have also provided a kind of ready-made border to the pictures. So the pictures are being supplied already set into a wallpaper, which is yet another innovation. This is a very grand example of that picture within border wallpaper, which survives at Schloss Schönbrunn in Vienna, installed in the early 19th century. So another amazing example of innovation and continuing innovation in Chinese wallpapers. They also introduced things like jardinières, as you can see in this wallpaper, these pots with plants in them on stands, and also bird cages and bird perches and balustrades. So the bird and flower wallpapers became more and more like scenes from actual Chinese gardens. And this is a very similar wallpaper surviving at Houghton Hall in Norfolk, hung at the very end of the 18th century. And it's more or less the same scenery as the previous image, but here it's been painted in shades of off-white and beige and gray. And initially we thought this might be fading, that the colors might have faded. But when we saw this watercolor from the same period, from about 1800, we realized it was already those colors at that time. So this must have been, again, a deliberate innovation, a deliberate stylistic version of the wallpaper, quite abstract in a way, much more like design, not strictly speaking realistic anymore, but very attractive and very beautiful. So that again is a development from the late 18th century. Chinese wallpapers remained popular in Regency era Britain, early 19th century. The Royal Pavilion was the most exuberant example of an Orientalist Asian style interior of the early 19th century. This is the saloon at the Royal Pavilion, created by the Prince Regent and his designers. And for the frieze around near the ceiling is fascinating too. Details taken from Chinese bamboo furniture, but blown up to a huge scale in a very free and interesting way. But again, using Chinese wallpapers with balustrades and bird cages on the walls as part of the decoration. As I mentioned, it's very popular still in the early 19th century. This is an example that's been recently recreated at Pitzhanger Manor in Ealing, where this wallpaper was known to have existed, and the artist Alistair Peebles with Nicola Pasterfield and Rachel Spelling have recently beautifully recreated this. This is a wallpaper that was given by the Prince Regent to the family who owned Temple Newsham near Leeds, and it was given by him in 1806. And again, it's a similar type with balustrades and jardinières, and has been in that house since that time. Another example of a Regency interior using Chinese wallpaper. The writer Sir Walter Scott built an amazing Scottish baronial style house at Abbotsford, but this didn't stop him from using Chinese wallpaper as well. He was given some Chinese wallpaper by his nephew, who was a captain in the ship captain in the East India Company, and here it is at Abbotsford in this Scottish baronial setting. And this was Penrhyn Castle, a neo-Norman castle, brand new in the 1830s. And again, it was not considered strange to use Chinese wallpaper in this castle setting. So early Victorian taste very much open to using Chinese elements together with European medieval elements. These are some of the details of the Penrhyn Castle wallpapers. Beautiful jardinière there, and a banana plant, but also bamboo being used increasingly in 19th century Chinese wallpapers. This beautiful example at Penrhyn Castle, still in its original colors. And again, some influence probably there from Indian chintz in the fact that the flowers are all different. The same tendril has multiple different flowers, which is something one sees on Indian chintz as well. Amazing example of bamboo wallpaper at Belton House. Beautiful rhythm of the bamboo culms. It's almost abstract on one level, and on another level, it's of course very detailed and beautifully executed. This is a detail of that with a frieze of small human figures in the foreground. And then by the late 19th century, Chinese wallpapers were being treated as antiques. They were being bought and sold from country houses and installed in other country houses as antiques. And this is an example of Castle Ashby, which came from another country house, 1871. And by the Edwardian period, Chinese wallpaper of the look of the British country house. They'd become part of one of the elements that you would expect in a British country house. So in this refurbishment of Beaudesert in 1912, they incorporated various different Chinese wallpapers brought from elsewhere in this interior. And a few years later, after the First World War, the house had to be sold, and the wallpapers were sold as well. And one of them ended up in New York. So the trade in Chinese wallpapers was now also transatlantic. They were being shipped to America as well as antiques. And this example of an interior at Kelmarsh Hall, which was the house of Nancy Lancaster, who later became famous as one of the creators of the English country house interior style. She also used Chinese wallpapers that she'd bought on the market, which had come from other houses previously. And this goes on today. This is an example of a wallpaper by created by the American firm Gracie, who use Chinese artisans. And this is a version of the wallpaper I showed earlier that ended up in New York, but a slightly enlarged version and created for today's tastes, obviously. And again, it shows how this has really become part of the language and tradition of traditional Western interior design. And finally, here is an example of the influence of Chinese wallpapers in fashion as well, that the exhibition China Through the Looking Glass a few years ago at the Metropolitan Museum in New York used various wallpapers by De Bruijn, which is another firm that currently produce traditional style Chinese wallpapers. They used them in the exhibition there, here together with a dress by Alexander McQueen, which was itself also influenced by the bird and flower language of Chinese wallpapers. So that's probably a good place to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, that was a fantastic survey. Tremendously interesting to me in the length of time that you cover, that and also, I mean, obviously you cover the development of different ideas, that the way that you go from original paintings and original prints and so on through to things that are mass produced, as it were, and then coming back, as it were, to a much more kind of designed style. It's extremely interesting. I was very interested in the movement from Suzhou, the printed wallpapers, to painting. I found that absolutely fascinating, that Suzhou prints, obviously quite sizable and could be used in a sort of wallpapery way, but once you get to, and thinking too of, I mean, the difference between, say, Suzhou prints or printed wallpapers on a smaller scale to some of those ones where you had an enormous spread. Just imagine the factory in China where someone or several people, many people are painting a frieze which goes on for, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 yards. I mean, to cover an immense wall, that's it's quite a kind of achievement. We should look and see if there are is there anything in, has anyone asked a question? I don't think so far, in which case, I don't know if people want to open up to putting any questions into the chat, but otherwise, I would like to continue a bit. There is one. No, this is just a thank you, but that's very nice. Thank you very much. It does indeed look fantastic. How easy is it to look after? I mean, how is it surviving in the country houses that the Trust looks after?
On the one hand, it's relatively robust because of the quality of the Chinese paper, with its relatively long fibers made from the inner bark of trees, as you know, and often made of several layers of that paper. So the paper itself is relatively robust, but of course, it also depends on the conditions in the particular house. In some houses, the wallpaper was installed on top of textiles, which were stretched on wooden frameworks and then set against the wall. That seems to have been the best way to preserve it because the air could circulate behind. Sometimes, though, they were simply pasted on top of the plaster, and that's often been more problematic because then you get, damp coming through eventually. Of course, they're sensitive to light, so in some cases they've faded, but in other cases they've been well looked after. So it's a relatively robust material, but a lot depends on the conditions it's been under. As you could see in that image of those three wallpapers I showed in those 3 different places, they all look quite different, which is basically because of their different conditions and histories.
We have a question here from Angia. Do you think William Morris's wallpaper was influenced by Chinese wallpaper as well?
That's a fascinating question. I've wondered about that, and it's quite difficult to know because there seem to be very few direct references to East Asian art in William Morris's designs, but there seem to be a lot of kind of indirect references, as if he must have been looking at those things, but he always translated it quite thoroughly into his own idiom. So it's really difficult to know exactly whether he wasn't what he was taking from either Chinese wallpapers or perhaps from Japanese design as well. So that's something somebody should really look into and try and research the Asian influences in William Morris. Yeah.
I think the idea of chintz, I mean, was very interesting. I remember one of the chintzes you showed had very distinct Chinese influence, in such it had rocks at the bottom. I mean, clearly meant to be Chinese rocks and plants raising above. And of course, chintz would be something that would go easily from India to China, so that East India Company merchants could well have taken chintz to China and said to the wallpaper people, copy this or just shown it to them. So, I mean, I think that would have been quite easy, but other things more different perhaps. There's another, hang on, there's some questions coming, which I must now read. It says, where have most of the wallpaper been produced in China then? Suzhou or other cities in the south of China?
Well, initially we think that the printed wallpapers of the 1740s and 50s were probably produced in Suzhou, because that was such a center, or perhaps the surrounding area, because that was such a center for high quality printing. We think the subsequent painted versions were generally produced in Guangzhou. By the late 18th century, there are some references in Dutch East India Company and English East India Company records of contacts with workshop managers in Guangzhou who were supplying these wallpapers. So certainly by that time, they seem to have been produced in Guangzhou. Yeah.
Another one here is quite complicated, from Hugo. It's widely recognized that ukiyo-e art has greatly influenced the European Impressionists in focusing on the subject only and eliminating excessive details and understanding the beauty of a flat appearance in artwork. Interestingly enough, this is also the characteristic of Chinese painting. So in your opinion, why is it ukiyo-e but not Chinese painting that influenced the European painting, given the strong presence of Chinese decorative art in Europe at the same time?
That's an interesting question. I certainly think Chinese art had quite a big influence on European culture, perhaps at a slightly earlier time. Of course, ukiyo-e was very influential when Japan opened up to the West in the late 19th century. But Chinese art was more influential, I suppose, earlier on. And for instance, there are a lot of cases of, I suppose, going back to what I was discussing about the 17th century, there's a lot of examples there of Chinese fine and decorative art influencing European decorative art, and then in and influencing the development of what we know as chinoiserie, imitation Asian art in Europe. And there may even be some influence as well. There seems to be some influence as well from Chinese aesthetics on the development, for instance, of the English landscape garden that Sir William Temple meant in the end of the 17th century, mentioned the attractiveness of naturalistic and asymmetrical landscape, Chinese landscape design and those elements were subsequently, of course, expressed in the English landscape garden as well. That's quite difficult to quantify because it's quite difficult to find, to document that exactly. But I think that there is a lot of, certainly in interior decoration, and for instance, also, I suppose, in the design of floral decoration in English decorative art, both from chintz and from Chinese bird and flower imagery, had a huge influence, I think, on British floral decoration, on fabrics, on wallpapers, in other media. So that would be a major example of, I suppose, of direct Chinese influence on British decorative art. Yeah.
I think there's a question of timing, that different things at different times, different fashions. I mean, we all know about that. And also different groups of people. I mean, if one's talking about the Impressionists and ukiyo-e or something, that's a group of people. But I mean, who would not particularly be sort of people who looked at wallpaper. But there are different people interested in interior design and decoration more. Anyway, so yeah, I think you've got influences, potential influences from all sorts of people at different times and on different groups. They say, what influence have those British historical oriented ornamentations brought to the designs and decorations of today, in your opinion?
Well, it's interesting how the taste for Orientalist decoration, Asian influenced decoration in Europe, in Britain, has continued from the 17th century to the present day. So it's still and that's a whole subject in itself, of course, but it's interesting how that became a kind of self-perpetuating tradition in its own right, sort of imitation Asian style in Western art and decoration. So that, I think, has been very influential and continues today in all sorts of ways. And of course, some of it can be slightly problematic because it can be inauthentic or it can be derivative, but equally it became its own tradition and it referred back to previous iterations of imitation Asian design. So as a cultural phenomenon, it's really fascinating. Yeah.
Who designed the wallpaper then, someone says, XJ? By Chinese designer, British designer, or by their cooperation?
I think effectively it's a cooperation because the motifs and the imagery definitely came from the Chinese side and were executed in Chinese materials and in Chinese style. But the concept of doing it in the format of a wallpaper was probably a European idea because the Europeans liked pictorial wallpaper, whereas the Chinese seem to have used plainer wallpapers at the time. So in that sense, it's that combination of those two media must have come through discussions between East India Company merchants and Chinese artisans and producers and workshop managers. We don't know, unfortunately, we have no record of what actually happened, but looking at the products, something like that must have happened.
Someone asked you about the wallpaper. Are they all made of silk or were there other textures? But I think, as you say, paper, but was there silk as well?
Some of them were painted on silk, and the people who were painting those silk wallpapers may also have worked on painted silk furnishing fabrics and dress fabrics as well for the European market. The majority of them were painted on paper, so it's both silk and paper. Yeah.
And what type of paint was used in 18th century Chinese wallpaper? Do contemporary wallpaper producers like De Bruijn use the same natural dyes or pigments?
The answer to the second question, I believe, is generally that yes, the current producers try and follow traditional materials and techniques as much as possible, depending on availability and on knowledge of what the exact materials were. in the 18th century. And unfortunately, I'm not an expert on 18th century Chinese pigments, so I wouldn't really be able to give much information about that, but they were the kind of pigments that were used in for Chinese art at that time. So interestingly, you do start to get a little bit of global exchange in materials. For instance, Chinese paintings on glass were often using European glass that had been brought to Guangzhou. And in the early 19th century, pigments like Prussian blue were available in China. But yeah, I'm less sure about exactly which Chinese pigments were being used.
You asked a very interesting question. A question inspired by the Dutch family taking tea, where the man holds the teapot. Does the word char lady have anything to do with char? Are you familiar with char lady as a term?
Vaguely, yes, but I don't know the etymology of char lady. Perhaps you know that better, Francis, what the origin of char lady is.
I will look into it. And it sounds very convincing. I mean, char lady basically is cleaner, really. She might have stopped to drink char, but was not meant to. That's something we'll have to go to the massive Oxford Dictionary and find out what the etymology is. Then another, if you compare the price of Chinese wallpaper in the 18th century with that of contemporary wallpaper from de Gournay in real terms, are they in a similar price category? If not, what attributes to the difference?
That's interesting. Yes, they probably are, in the sense that back then they were luxury wallpapers, and they tended to be, as far as we know, we only have a few bits of documentation, but they tended to be more expensive than European luxury wallpapers, so really at the top of the market. And of course today, you know, those Gournay, Gracie, Fremantle wallpapers are also luxury wallpapers, handmade, bespoke, etc. So yes, roughly the same kind of luxury bracket indeed. Yeah.
Yes, I think one gets inventories and so on, but listing. But I don't think there are many places where you can find out the actual price. I mean, and a lot of things would have gone through various hands, wouldn't they? The ship's captains bring them back, but who sells them on is a question.
Yes.
Someone asked. Sorry.
No, beg your pardon, just quickly to say there was an interesting study by Professor John Stobart about Stoneleigh Abbey, and he found some inventories for the furnishing of several rooms, and you could compare the prices for the Chinese wallpapers and the European wallpapers, and that was an example where it showed that the Chinese ones tended to be more expensive than the European ones.
Thank you. Someone says, curious, the themes of wallpaper. Were there any themes more favored in the West that China particularly produced to fit the needs?
It's interesting that the subjects of the wallpapers followed these traditional Chinese subjects so closely, in the sense of landscape and bird and flower. And you got mixtures of them, that you got bird and flower combined with landscape, or you got pictures of landscapes, or you got innovations in that they put balustrades and jardinières in the bird and flower scenes. But they did stick quite closely to those overall themes. I'm imagining partly because they were so successful in the European market, and perhaps because this was a traditional these were traditional themes which had been practiced by these artists over so many generations that they were being done so confidently and so in such a sophisticated way that the design of these wallpapers was therefore so effective. Even if you didn't understand anything about the symbolism, it still made sense from the point of view of visual integrity, and that's probably one of the factors why they were so popular in Europe, that visual integrity that they showed.
Yes, I think you, in developing your theme, you showed so many of the items that sort of began to to form the idea of China in the Western mind, and these come out so much in the wallpaper that the sorts of things you might have seen in Newhoff or whatever appear in the wallpaper in different ways. So there was already, as you said, a created idea of China, which was expressed very much in the wallpaper. I was quite interested in reading the other day, and I'm not sure that I believe it entirely, that do you know the Chinese wallpaper in Coutts Bank that shows cities, well, town scenes of commerce. And someone suggested that Lord Macartney had given the wallpaper to Coutts, his banker, and had given him specifically a wallpaper that depicted merchant life, because that was very much how Lord Macartney saw Coutts. I'm not sure if I entirely buy that, but I don't know if you have a view.
Well, it would have been relatively easy at the time to buy such a wallpaper in London through the kind of established retail trade channels. So it's more likely that it came through those channels. And equally, that wallpaper is very similar to fragments also found at Carton House, which were already at Carton in 1759. So it actually may be a slightly older wallpaper, which was available in the British market. So again, that seems to indicate that rather than it didn't come through Macartney, but just through the established trade channels. Yeah. And often that sometimes people assume automatically, oh, it must have come through a relation who was in the East India Company or something. But actually it was, if you had the money, it was much easier just to buy it in London, in a luxury shop. Yeah.
It's interesting that I think the wallpaper in Coutts, they've moved it several times, haven't they? The boardroom has been moved from one bit of the building to the other. And so they obviously have taken care. I think it probably is on frames. As you said, the best way of mounting it is actually not actually pasted to the wall, but raised slightly away from the wall. So anyway.
Yes, I think Alison McDermott, the conservator, has worked on that particular wallpaper. Yeah.
Someone says, what's your opinion about the contemporary trend of Chinese decoration or decorative art in the UK and contemporary UK decorative art in China? What kind of theme is more likely to be welcomed by people from both countries? Any recent good examples, please? Thank you.
Well, that's a huge topic in itself, but I suppose, as I mentioned earlier, the taste for East Asian decoration and East Asian style decoration in Britain is a very well established tradition in its own right. So in that sense, for instance, as expressed in floral decoration, which has permeated into British decorative art as well. So that is likely to continue, and sometimes it almost becomes unrecognizable. It's so kind of domesticated into British culture and British visual traditions that you almost don't recognize its Asian origins anymore. And that in itself is really interesting, that process of domestication of but sometimes equally you get the opposite movement, and there's a very self-conscious orientalizing tendency that people want to make something look purposefully Asian, even if it isn't. So that's the other side of that, which is fascinating as well.
And I think the final question, this Chinese sort of decorative influence has greatly reduced in the last 200 years. What's the main reason behind this?
Well, I think partly it's just that domestication, in the sense that it's still very much there. And as you see with Chinese wallpapers, they remained popular. They have remained popular and till the present day, effectively, and now they're being produced anew by those companies we've been mentioning. So it's been up and down, the popularity of these things and these styles, but I think also there's a huge amount of continuity, and you know, the Western taste for Asian style porcelain is another example, and the Western interest in lacquer of various kinds continues as well, and you know, various types of Chinese silk and so on. So I think there's a lot of continuity, and inevitably it goes up and down, but in accordance to Western fashions. But as you, for instance, saw in that image from the Metropolitan Museum exhibition, a lot of present-day fashion designers are inspired by Asian motifs and Chinese decorative motifs and styles. So that's another really interesting area where there's a lot of repercussions of Chinese style.
And certainly, I think I mean, I haven't visited all of the houses that you've shown, but I can remember going, for example, into Houghton Hall and being simply overwhelmed by the glorious colour of the Chinese wallpaper. So I think that all of us have got plenty of opportunity to go and visit the National Trust houses and be inspired and take the whole thing a lot further. Thank you very much indeed for wonderful pictures. And I found it, as I say, it's a talk that inspired me to sort of, you know, get on a bus and go somewhere immediately and look at Chinese wallpaper in a National Trust house. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes, I think Francis, it's my turn.
Yes.
And what an extraordinary talk, which opened a new window about China. Thank you very much, Francis and Emile, for delivering such a knowledgeable talk, and for your great support to rediscover China in the UK. I think many audience, just like Francis said, might already begin to plan their, you know, Chinese wallpaper in the UK study or tour in the National Trust houses, you know, in the near future. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the co-host partners, the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding and the China Travel Service and Information Center, and the event supporter cultural section of the Chinese Embassy in the UK. My thanks also go to Cambridge China Center, which kindly provide the 小儿童 live service to audiences in China, and media friends and partners of CNTO London, and the audiences in the UK and China for joining us. Thank you all for making this online event such a successful one. By the way, for those who love China art and culture, Sky TV 191 is a good choice every afternoon, weekdays. A documentary 13行 about, you know, the similar period of Chinese, you know, wallpaper in UK tells about stories between UK and China would be screened. So finally, we hope to have your continued support and participation in our future Rediscover China in the UK talks. Stay tuned and see you soon. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.